God Conversations with Tanya Harris.
So let me ask you that question. What does God sound like?
Well, thunder, lightning.
Mother Teresa, someone asked her, when does God speak to you? And she said, whenever he wants.
So essentially the Bible is a collection of God conversations, if you like.
I had a vision of a car accident and I'm sitting on the couch thinking, why have I just seen this?
How could I know if God was speaking to me? How could I know that dream or that thought was actually just me thinking about, I just had some bad pizza?
Jesus said we'd recognise his voice and follow him. It was never meant to be a one-way conversation. GodConversations.com.
Hi, and welcome to episode 27 of the God Conversations podcast. My name is Tanya Harris, and I'm a pastor, speaker, and founder of GodConversations.com. Well, Happy New Year! Welcome to 2016. I realise for some of you it may be a little bit beyond that now, but hey, I say let's just keep celebrating. I like this time of the year. I just find it such a great time to reflect on all the things that have been past and then things to come as well. Where were you on New Year's Eve? I was up with some friends up at Lake Macquarie, 2 hours north of Sydney, and we had this tiny little fireworks display on New Year's, which is a little bit smaller than the Sydney Harbour equivalent. But, it's just so great to be with family and friends and take some time out just to reflect on all that's been. 2015 was a fabulous year for God Conversations. I personally visited 30 different churches all around the world, which was fabulous. I think the best thing about that is hearing the personal testimonies of hearing God speak. But also lots of other good things happened during the year. We launched God Conversations for Women, which is kind of a sub-branch of the ministry, particularly looking at the obstacles and challenges that women face. But funnily enough, it was interesting on the website and our section for the women, many of the blogs there got the most hits out of the entire year. So that was interesting. The other big thing about 2015 for me was that I started a doctorate looking at people's experiences in hearing God's voice, a doctorate of ministry it will be. It will take me 3 years to do. So lots of new stretching in those areas. In fact, I often joke to my friends, I thought that I had a relatively decent level of intelligence until I started my doctorate, when I found myself reading articles where I knew absolutely had no idea what they were talking about. So, but as I said, a good stretching experience. And we're really praying that God will use that study to reach churches all over the world and help pastors and leaders, particularly to facilitate hearing God's voice in their churches. So 2016 beckons. But that's not what I want to talk about today. I just want to thank you, my podcast listeners and blog subscribers, for all your support in 2015. It's just so great to receive words of encouragement, your emails and testimonies, and every time you share a Facebook post or retweet a tweet on Twitter, we really appreciate your support, because our heart is to get this message out there to the people who really want to know what God's voice sounds like. So thank you to you. Thank you for being such a great support in this ministry. So let's have a think about the topic of this podcast. 2015, like the year before, was full of bad news, that particularly coming out of the Middle East. So many horrific accounts of persecution in that area. We saw that terrible stream of news coming out of Syria with the refugees. We heard about earthquakes. We heard about shootings in Paris and Beirut, terrorist attacks in places that we wouldn't expect, and just this very difficult stream of news. And I don't know about you, but we find ourselves in our lounge room, sitting on the couch, perhaps watching the TV and feeling very powerless. What are we supposed to do? How do we respond? How do we respond as Christians? And what is God saying in the midst of global chaos? What is he saying in the midst of this terror that's affecting our world? So what I want to do today is share an interview with you. Just before Christmas, I spoke to John Peachey at Rhema, New Zealand, on the morning show, and we talked about this topic. We talked about what God is saying using what he already said. See, the times that we experience today are not that dissimilar from the first century. The Christians then were under threat of brutal attacks in the same way many of the people in the Middle East are today. So we're going to look at what Jesus said, what God said in the midst of that situation. We're going to bring it back to our own personal response. And what is God saying to us? So today, here's podcast 27, Hearing God in the Global Chaos. I hope that it blesses you.
This is Rhema, and I'm John Peachey, and it's a great privilege to have on the phone with me a lady whose voice you all know, Tanya Harris from God Conversations. Of course, she contributes on a regular basis to our program in those wonderful God spots. Tanya, how are you doing?
I'm doing great, John. Hello from across the Tasman.
Indeed, and Aussie's all well today, I hope.
Yeah, she's doing great. Actually, I was in your country a couple of weeks ago, so exploring some of the South Island. It was fantastic.
And I
feel like a distant cousin.
That's right, yes. Crazy cousin Tanya from across the ditch.
Mm-hmm.
And were you were on a speaking tour here?
Yeah, I was. A number of churches in the Southland region, which was fantastic. But I dragged my host up to the Kepler track as well. So I got a bit of a taste of your country. I loved it.
Oh, good on you.
Wonderful down that corner of the world. Hello, anyone who's listening down that way.
I'm sure. We've just opened up some new stations down that way, so I'm sure that people will be listening. And look, I appreciate you joining me today because I wanted to talk to you because some of the conversations that I'm reading around the place on Christian blogs and in Facebook and so forth, you know, the fount of all knowledge in Facebook, there are some people who are wringing their hands a little bit in terms of the current news environment, the things that are going on in Syria, the things that are going on with shootings in Paris and in the US. It could easily be a time where people of faith start to lose their head a little bit in terms of what is God doing, how am I hearing from God in the midst of turmoil and difficult circumstances. So I thought, seeing as you speak and you research and you love the topic of conversations with God, I thought we'd ask you to maybe tell us what you're thinking at the moment.
Yeah, it is. It's a difficult time, isn't it? So much happening in the world at the moment. Well, I want to draw on a God conversation that took place back in the first century. How does that sound?
It sounds good to me.
You know, we're coming up to Christmas, and I was thinking about that Christmas carol, always, you know, silent night, always calm and always bright. And we love Christmas because it has this sense of peace and calmness. But if we look back at the first century, there was a lot of turmoil going on for the Christians back then as well. So, you know, the Christmas message is a Christmas of peace and of goodwill, but it came amongst incredible national turmoil in the first century with the Roman Empire the way it was. So I love drawing on the God conversations on the past in order to understand what God's saying to us in the future. So is that okay? Can we sort of talk about that, what was going on then?
I think we can. And as you say, the first century, I mean, there was plenty of turmoil going on, so a very good place to start, I think.
Yeah. Well, particularly I think with some of the faces of evil that we're seeing today, probably more than ever before, just becoming very brutal, some of the things happening in the Middle East. But the first century, I think, with the Jewish people and then the early church was faced with some of the turmoil of the Roman Empire. They were quite a brutal government, particularly towards the end of the first century. Just at a time when Christians began to get persecuted. I think we have this picture that we don't always see clearly. We get the stories of Jesus and the early church, but it was against a backdrop where the Romans at different times started to persecute the church. And the church is faced with this situation. Well, what do we do about it? You know, we hear stories of beheadings and shootings and terrorism today, but that was also, you know, that sort of thing was becoming more prevalent at the end of the first century with the Romans doing public crucifixions and, you know, some of the gladiator stories that we see on our movie screens. That was certainly around then. And the book of Revelation was a book that was spoken to that time. I don't know if you've read it lately, John.
No, I read bits and pieces, but not read it in its entirety recently. No.
Yeah. It's one of those books that's a little bit out there. And I often say I think Tolkien got his inspiration from the book.
No, absolutely.
Because it has just an amazing variety of images, and it's a certain type of genre in the Bible, but actually it has a really powerful message to what the Spirit was saying to those 7 churches in Asia Minor that were also facing persecution. And I think perhaps, you know, we live in Western countries where these things aren't happening, but the news is bringing it closer to us. But the 7 churches there were facing possible martyrdom. And in the midst of that, God comes and speaks by his Spirit to the Apostle John And he gives them a message that tells them basically to keep following Jesus, keep following the ways of Jesus. You get this amazing scene in Revelation chapter 5 of the throne room of God, and, you know, the government of the kingdom sitting around saying, who's worthy to open this document and this key to the kingdom. And then the scene that happens is you get this lamb, this sacrificial lamb that walks in, and it's a lamb that's been slain, and it's an unusual lamb because it's got 7 horns and 7 eyes, and you see this lovely symbolism of strength and of vision. And I think God's saying what you need to do in the midst of turmoil, what you need to do in the midst of global crisis when evil is coming at you and touching you personally, is to really look to the example of Jesus and follow the way of Jesus. And then we have to ask ourselves, well, what is that way? How did Jesus conquer evil? How did Jesus conquer instability? And what he did ultimately was he gave his life. He said, greater love has no one, that he sacrifices his life, lays down his life. And the core of the Christian message is to love, is to follow the way of Jesus, even in the midst of turmoil. I think that's the kingdom idea that we see, that God's kingdom is an upside-down kingdom. It's opposite. Love overcomes evil. So, you know, in our personal attitudes to some of the issues that we're facing today, I think that's the bottom line. Before we even start talking about political strategy, or when we start talking about what government should be doing, the heart of the Christian has to emulate the heart of Jesus in the midst of these situations. You know, when we look at Christmas time, we see, you know, a baby being born, a baby in a manger, this quiet scene. It's not a king coming on his throne with all the power at his hands, but it's a baby. And what we see in Revelation, it's a lamb, one who gives, one who loves, and one who shows us what the way of God and the heart of God is, even in the face of evil. So that's bottom line. Before we even go any further, how does that sound?
Yeah, well, I think that's fantastic, because as you were talking, I was thinking about 2 things. One is that a lot of people are personally touched now by some of these events that are going on in the world. I mean, the Paris attacks. I talked to people one person I talked to who was a connection of a connection, you know, within those sort of degrees of separation, lived 30 metres from one of the shootings. They live right there. So we're in touch with that. But, this term radicalisation, of course, is rising all the time. And I agree with you. I mean, I think when we deal with radicalisation on one side of the equation, our answer is radicalisation on the other, in terms of Jesus' message was a radical message. Love your enemies. Love those who persecute you. That's a crazy message, but yet it's the answer, isn't it?
Yeah, it's foolishness. You know, Paul talks about it's foolishness. The gospel is foolishness, and I think we tend to lose that. We're so used to this message of Jesus on the cross, but it's scandalous. It cuts against the grain. And I think, you know, even at a really personal level, when we're dealing with interpersonal conflict, where someone is being hateful towards us, it cuts right into that situation. Well, how do I retaliate? What do I do?
Yeah, that's right. What do I
grace,
do? Yeah. I
show love, and it's counter to the human nature. And this is where the cross comes in, I think. So, before we even look at the big scale issues, the heart of the Christian has to sit and stand before God and say, if I have the Spirit of Jesus operating in me, I need to look at what that means for loving in the face of evil, because it's love that overcomes. It's love that breaks the power of the enemy. And again, back to the Christmas scene, you know, in Revelation chapter 12, it kind of gives us this behind the scenes look. That's what Revelation does. It's like a peek behind the theatrical curtain. What's going on behind the scenes in the spiritual realm? And you see this image of this pregnant woman giving birth, and the enemy is standing over her in the shape of a dragon. Again, it's very symbolic. But that this war breaks out in the heavenlies, and it's a war against good and evil. And Jesus comes to show us this is how you overcome personally in your life. This is how you defeat the kingdom of the world.
Isn't it?
How God's kingdom operates.
Isn't it interesting that, you know, we sometimes in the midst of practical turmoil, if I can put it that way, where people are being unkind to you, or situations are not looking great, we can forget that, of course, we fight not against the powers of this world, but against the powers of darkness, against spiritual forces. We're reminded of that. Paul reminds us of that. And so we can't forget that. Yeah. No,
it does cut down to a personal level. It's not about pointing our fingers at what other people are doing. It says, what am I doing?
Oh, ouch. Yes, that's right.
No, I'm starting to preach, Don. Look what you got.
But it's right, isn't it? I mean, and I think it's relevant to say that, you know, amongst the big of what's going on, the huge, the broad, that it does come back, you know, and I think this is the wonderful message of the gospel. Every time we've got to draw it back into, okay, what is my response? How do I love that person? How do I love that situation? And I don't know how to respond to a group of terrorists with automatic weapons that kill people in France. I don't know what my response to that is, apart from all I can respond to in one respect is, and this is probably controversial to say it, but those people that committed those acts are somebody's son, someone's daughter, someone's grandchildren who have been, their minds have been taken over by somebody else's intention. And all I can do is pray for those families because while there are grieving going on, and rightly so for those that have been killed, there's grieving going on by the grandparents and the uncles and aunties of those people who must be just devastated by their relatives creating this harm.
Yeah,
so I think we've got to bring it back to those really individual responses, don't we?
Yeah, I think so, and understand what's going on behind the scenes too for those people. I read an article recently that was talking about some of the villages in the Middle East where these terrorist cells are developing, and they're getting people where they're young, they're uneducated, they're brainwashed, if you like, and there's the power of that culture developing. And what does it mean to help this situation? What does it mean now? And it's obviously a very complex issue, and I don't. I don't have any quick, easy solutions for it. But I think that, again, we must look at the example and the heart of Jesus as Christians before we even start that conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I totally agree with you.
And this one I think is missing sometimes.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. I think that's controversial subjects that you're getting into, but I think I think you're absolutely right. And when unfortunately we're not aloof from it, because even in your own country in the last a couple of days, people arrested, 15-year-olds arrested for terror plots. I mean, man, it's close to home, Tanya, isn't it?
Yeah, and this kind of thing that's developing against Muslims, this hatred and this protesting, and it's so un-Christ-like. I see Christians engaging in that, and this is where I think this is a problem, because again, what's the heart of Jesus in this situation? How does God feel? And the Spirit is at work in the Middle East. There's so many stories, you may have heard them, John, coming out of leading terrorists and people within that world having visions of Jesus in their dreams and getting converted. And we look at, again, back to the book of Revelation, where you've got that scene of the prayers of the saints as incense going up to heaven and coming back down as powerful thunder and lightning. And, our prayers in that situation, the weapons of our warfare, which are not carnal, they're spiritual, our prayers have effect to make a difference. But we can't always see them. But behind the scenes, they're certainly having powerful effects. So we need to keep praying. We need to actually pray into those. Every time we hear a situation, a news report, something that's going on, pray. Use the weapons that we have available to us as Christians. We can be an incredibly strong fighting force, and our prayers make a difference.
Yeah, and I think you make a really good point. The Spirit of God is active in the Middle East. It's not like God's gone, I'll draw a red circle around that one on the map and I won't go there.
Yeah.
It's not true. Yeah. It's that the Spirit of God is at work for the sake of the kingdom in the Middle East. And we do need to remember that sometimes you can feel like, where is God in the midst of it? But as you say, I mean, one of the beautiful things is that Jesus is appearing to the Muslim population, sovereignly appearing. In fact, the story of the man in white in people's dreams is just happening everywhere.
It's everywhere, isn't it? I read a story recently in a book called Dreams and Visions by Tom Doyle, and it had a woman who was on pilgrimage to Mecca. And if you know, Mecca is the city in Saudi Arabia where no one else is allowed to go unless you're a Muslim. And so you can't actually have Christians in that city. And she's on pilgrimage, that annual pilgrimage that Muslims are required to take once in their lifetime. And so she's going through all the rituals, and then she goes to bed at night and Jesus appears to her. And I think that is just awesome, because Jesus got through passport control in the way no Christian could,
That's right.
And there's stories like that that are coming out, well recorded stories. We're not talking about lovely things that someone made up, but actually legitimate accounts of God working in people's lives. And that's what we need to be praying so that God can go into those places where we can't, and where violence, is not the answer, I don't believe. So let's believe that God's Spirit is more powerful than evil and more powerful than violence, and that Jesus shows us the way for what to do in tumultuous situations like these.
Look, absolutely. My guest on the phone from Australia, Tanya Harris, and again, her voice will be familiar to you for God Conversations, and it's godconversations.com. Let's take a short break. We'll come back, and I just want to continue the conversation because I think it's a great conversation in the midst of difficult world times. But I love the fact that we're relating this back to Jesus and what would Jesus do in these situations. This is Rhema. I'm John Peachey, back in just a moment.
Have you ever heard one of those stories about someone who thought they heard from God, but they actually didn't? Then there's all the damage and fallout that goes with it. We know that God speaks, but how do we know it's His voice we're hearing and not something we made up ourselves? The good news is that Jesus promised His people we'd be able to know His voice and follow it. Just like the Bible characters who've gone before us, we can learn to recognise His voice. The Other Side of the Conversation series is designed to take you step by step through the biblical teaching on hearing God's voice, as well as plenty of practical tips that you can apply in the context of your local church. We've worked really hard to create an excellent resource that has been used in churches all around the world and has the potential to change your life. The box set includes a documentary-style DVD with 6 15-minute episodes, plus a guidebook for individual or small group use. You can buy it online from Curon Books in Australia, Manor in New Zealand, or at the godconversations.com store. Remember, the ability to hear God's voice is given to everyone who chooses to follow Jesus. It was never meant to be a one-way conversation.
Well, this is Rhema. I'm John Peachey. On the phone with me, the lovely Tanya Harris, godconversations.com out of Australia, and special dispensation to talk to Australia today. So they've opened the electronic borders. And
we'll let the Kiwis in.
Let the Kiwis in, I know. Don't put us in Christmas Island, though. That's the trouble. It's locking us up in foreign places. Crazy.
Yeah.
Hey, so good. So I love this thinking around, relating everything back to what would Jesus do. And
yes.
I don't like those bracelets, WWJD, but I do like the thought of what would Jesus do?
Yeah, it is. I think that, and we talk about having a God conversation and what would Jesus say in this situation, and we've got that lovely testimony of what He's already said in the midst of global chaos, and I think that's a standard for us, isn't it?
Yes, I think you're right. Yeah, and it's important to remember that God has, Jesus has already spoken into this situation, if you like, and His word is there very clear for us to understand. So the whole concept of what was happening in the church in the first century AD in terms of persecution. So what we're experiencing, although unfortunately because of social media and the media in general, we're seeing it in graphic colour.
Yes, we are.
But it's not unusual. I mean, persecution has been around since the days of, since Saul, who became Paul, was instigating the persecution.
Yeah, and that's exactly right. But the interesting thing is, again, if we look back into the book of Revelation, what we see is that, the churches then were facing a similar situation. What do we do with a brutal empire that's coming against us? And we ask that question, what do we do with terrorism coming against us? What's going on? And the first thing that God says in the midst of that situation is, this is a spiritual battle. There are things going on behind the scenes as well. So the way to overcome it is using God's spiritual weapons, not our natural weapons, and not the natural human ways that we establish kingdom and empire. Could I say it that way? Because you've got a kind of like the human kingdom and then the spiritual kingdom. And the Spirit of Jesus in Revelation keeps calling us back to the kingdom-mindedness of Jesus, which says that love overcomes evil. And the beautiful thing about it is that you also see in that book is that the saints are portrayed as wearing righteous white robes. They've been dipped in blood, symbolising their salvation, but it's the righteous acts of the saints. So the things that Jesus did. So he preached the good news of the kingdom, but he also loved those who were hated. He lifted up the poor. He set the captive free. He bathed the wounds. He touched the lepers of people, and he made a difference in people's lives by their actions. And you see that in the early church. They didn't have a platform. They didn't have a TV show. They didn't have a radio program. But the Roman Empire eventually noticed that this is what the early church did. They were known for their love that they had for each other. And they were the ones who, when the plagues hit, when the sickness came, they were the ones who went out and tended them. They touched the leper. They lifted up the poor. They did the things that Jesus did. And that's what got the attention of the Roman Empire. That's what built the church. That's what made them strong. And, you know, it's difficult to do. It's not easy to do. It's counterintuitive, I think, for the human, but that's what it means to live God's ways and not our own.
Yeah, and I think it's good to highlight that it is counterintuitive. It's the way that we've been raised. I mean, not in the church necessarily, but by culture as a very individualistic society.
Yeah.
It's how can I climb to the top of the pile? How can I build my wealth, my brand, my name? And Jesus goes, you know what? If you want to be all those things, here's what you got to do. Turn the pyramid upside down and serve everybody else. Love everybody else.
Yes.
It is, you know, it's a fantastic message, but it's a countercultural. It's a kind of like, how does that work? Kind of message.
Tony Campolo called it the upside down kingdom, I think it was.
Yes, that's a great way of looking at it. Yeah, the upside down kingdom.
Yeah. But the outcome is that at the end of the day, God's kingdom wins, and I think we see it in our own lives just as we interact with people. When someone accuses me and I accuse them back, when someone insults me and I insult them back, then it just continues to build and the cycle is never broken. But when someone says a bad word to me, I counter it with a loving, kind word or a gracious word, and it stops it. It overcomes it. And so the same principle holds here.
Well, it's a sort of message that we want to tell the children in our society is to turn the other cheek when someone's unkind to you, repay them with kindness. And sometimes that can not feel like a great message for our kids because it's unusual and it's countercultural. But the kingdom is upside down, and that is exactly what we need to do. See, I often say to people, if you're having trouble with someone, just pray for them, ask God to bless them, and what will happen is your heart will change.
Yes.
And even with terrorists, I mean, dare I say it, with these terrorists, I mean, pray a blessing on them. Pray God, let your spirit meet them. Let them run headlong into the love of Jesus. Because I look at it like this, Tanya, that the people who don't know Jesus, they still live in the same loss that we were in. They still live in this tension between the kingdom is here but not here. Some have met him, some haven't met him yet. Some have come to revelation of who Jesus is, and some haven't. And they just fall into the haven't category. But they're all trying to fill their void. And I believe this passionately. People are just trying to fill their void with whatever they can fill it with, so they don't feel the loss that they feel. And of course, that loss goes back to the Garden of Eden. It goes back to Father God. Dad was walking in the garden, and then it all got screwed up. Isn't that right? Isn't that what we're trying to do? We're just trying to get back to that point in the garden where I'm walking with my Father. He knows me, and I know him, and all is well.
Absolutely. And we, as Christians, know what it is to experience grace. So we should be the ones who are the givers of great grace. Yeah, John, I read an article recently I think it was a piece of research coming out of the States, just how Christians were known for their judgmentalism. And it distressed me because how did we get to be in that place where we've been receivers of grace? Therefore, we need to be dispensers of grace. And whether I agree with someone about their philosophical perspective or even their religion, you can still have discernment and disagreement, but the idea is to be able to show great grace. That's what being a Christian is all about. We should be known for our grace and our love. That's what Jesus said. We will be known for that. So, again, it cuts down to the bottom. What does it mean to be a Christian? What does it mean to follow Jesus? It means to live like he did. It means to act like he did. It means to speak like he did. And I think that applies to our personal situations and the global situation as well.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with you. And how we got this reputation has been critical. I don't know, because the primary message of the gospel is that, you're forgiven and you need to forgive others and embrace the grace that's been given you. And it's so we,
right.
I think we need to look at ourselves sometimes in that regard. And if we embrace the loving our enemies, which is such a strange thing, I know, but if we embrace that, God is saying that people will just know. They'll just know there's a difference going on.
Yeah. I love that. Preach it, brother.
No, you're the eye turn.
Now to actually go and do it, John. This is the tough part.
Well, that's the hard part, isn't it? That's right. And it's always the hard part. But Jesus knew that, and I think that's why the Spirit of God is so gentle with us, is because He knows that it's a tough gig. I mean, when you're God, you can love everybody, but when you're not, when you're God with a little G, carrying God around inside of you, it's not such an easy thing. And
Yes.
But we're given grace for grace. I think, if I can put it that way, I think that's the key.
Yeah. And having the Spirit in our lives makes a big difference. In talking to people about how to hear God's voice, often I say to people, people who are struggling, I want to hear God speaking to me. And often the case is we've actually heard Him speak, but we haven't heard Him say what we want Him to say. He's talking to us about our attitude, our unforgiveness, or our hatred towards someone. And we're like, no, but actually that's the Spirit of God speaking to us.
Yes, well, now you're in dodgy territory now. That's right. But you're quite right. I think sometimes we want to hear great revelation when the Spirit of God is saying, you know what, that person that you dislike at work, you need to get over that one.
That's right. Go and make them a cup of coffee.
Yeah.
Go and buy them lunch.
That's right. Yeah. There we go. Oh, absolutely.
Counterintuitive. Yes.
Well, I think
Spirit-led.
it's a great conversation, and I appreciate you talking to us today, because I think in the midst of trouble, we just need to remember the basics, and that actually God has got it covered. He didn't go, oh no, I don't know what's going to happen when ISIS rise up. I have no idea what I'm going to do now. That's not who God is. He goes business as usual.
And there is victory, and God wins regardless. And I think that's always the hope that we have, is that the book has been written, the end of the story has been declared, God wins, and we're on the winning side. So, but we do need to play by His rules.
Yeah, that's true. Actually, we need to play by His rules. But you've got an unfair advantage. You've read the end of the book, so you know what happens.
Yeah, that's right.
Look, I think it's fantastic.
Great to chat with you, John.
Well, Tanya Harris and God Conversation, it's always a pleasure.
We hope you've enjoyed this podcast by Tanya Harris. We'd love to hear your thoughts on this topic. So post your comments on the blog page of godconversations.com. Remember, Jesus said we would know His voice. It was never meant to be a one-way conversation.